I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we continue our reporting from the ground in Donbas with Roland Oliphant. We bring you diplomatic updates from across the world, and we discuss the role of the Russian Orthodox Church and its ties to the Kremlin.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 1st of February, day 343. And with me to discuss the most recent events in Ukraine, I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nichols. From Donbas, Senior Foreign Correspondent Roland Oliphant, our Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, and our guest is analyst and researcher Olga Lautman, a Senior Fellow at CEPA, that's the Centre for European Policy Analysis, and host of the Kremlin File podcast. Dom Nichols, can I come to you? What have you been looking at?
The area of the Donbas where Roland is incredibly violent at the moment and very confusing. So differing reports about the town of Bakhmut, which is a major crossroads in the eastern Donbas. Russia is claiming that it is encircling, not has encircled, but is encircling Bakhmut. I think that's what we've been seeing for the last few days, but I mean, it is not completely encircled. They're trying to take control of the highway connecting that city to Chasiv Yar, where Roland's been reporting from in recent days. Looking at the Institute for the Study of War, US-based think tank, they're saying that that Bakhmut is still very, very violent, and that the Wagner group, although they culminated, which is the military expression meaning that they can no longer take offensive action. They're exhausted, basically, not going backwards, but no longer take offensive action. So the Wagner group culminated, but Russia has backfilled that area with conventional forces to keep pushing on. Bakhmut is very. It's not just symbolic for Russia. They've been attacking it for nearly a year now. They started very, very early on in this latest phase of the war. But it is a crossroads. It is a logistic hub in its own right. So it does have operational value, maybe not strategic value, but has operational value. So the ISW was saying, they're quoting the head of a Ukrainian unit in the area, Denis Yarolavsky, saying that Russia has put in what he calls, quote, super qualified, unquote, Russian conventional military troops backing up Wagner. Now, I was in a briefing yesterday. The reason I had to dash from the pod yesterday was that I went to a briefing with a Western official, and the Western official was saying that Soledar, which is the town just about 5 km to the northeast of Bakhmut. Soledar for Russia was a Pyrrhic victory. That's what the Western official was calling it, a Pyrrhic victory, and said that several thousand casualties were lost to secure a ruined town with about 500 inhabitants. And the Western official said Soledar was a sideshow of a sideshow, but a step towards Russia's attempts to take the larger town of Bakhmut, which it's been trying to achieve since May. Now, regarding any possible Ukrainian withdrawal from Bakhmut, and there's no suggestion that's happening at the moment, but just in terms of thinking about ahead and what might come, the Western official talking about any possible future withdrawal said, quote, Ukrainians have been very good in the past about choosing when to withdraw. Severodonetsk was an example of that. They didn't suffer many casualties as a consequence and redrew their defensive lines. They are constantly building the next level of fortification so they can fall back to it if required. It's a matter of judgment about when to do that, or indeed if to do that. The official went on, Bakhmut is a devastating First World War-like operating environment. Both sides are suffering from logistic challenges. There is parity in the force ratio. Even though on paper Russia has greater mass, what we've seen is they haven't been able to employ that successfully on the battlefield. Ukraine has the advantage of superior Western military equipment. Plus, there's been some poor decision-making on the Russian side, coupled with some pretty agile thinking on the Ukrainian side. The official finished, when you stack up all of these positives and negatives, you end up in a sort of grinding conflict, which at the moment looks like it continues through 2023 unless something significant changes, unquote. So, hugely violent. There is going to be changes of territory. That we are seeing that has happened. It will happen again. For all the the might that Russia's throwing at it, though. They are making tiny advances, and it is costing them dear. Other social media posts that we can see, unverified, but there's quite a number of them, saying that, or reiterating that suggestion that the quality Russian troops, or those experienced, I should say, are just simply not there anymore. They're either dead, wounded, or back. Somebody needs to go back to train these new mobilized soldiers in Russia. So what's happening at the moment seems to be that Russia is going for mass. They are just pushing people forward. The Ukrainians are calling them meat battalions. They are just running forward at Ukrainian lines and trying to overwhelm them. At the moment, that's not happening. It is very contested. It's difficult to get news out, as we've literally just heard from Roland. But it seems as if the town of Bakhmut is still in Ukrainian hands. There are efforts from Russia to push around to the south and to the southwest, but it is not yet encircled, and that fight is still going on.
Thanks very much for that, Dom, for that on the line. Roland, where are you and what have you been seeing?
Hi there. Once again in the glorious Telegraph studio, which means the back seat of the car, somewhere in the Donbas. What have I been doing? I mean, what can I tell you? I know it's a bit hackneyed with me. I always talk about the fog of war and kind of commit the enormous journalistic crime of saying, well, I don't know. This is what I can tell you. So yesterday, I think it's pretty clear the Russians made quite a serious push on Bakhmut and on the area of Bakhmut, and I think probably to try and cut that road, that southern road between Konstantinovka and Bakhmut. It was very loud. There was a lot of firing, and there was a degree, or I wouldn't say panic. I very seldom see panic around here, but definitely worry, definitely despondency. And I was getting kind of told late last night that the situation has changed, the line's changing quickly. Bakhmut might have been possible to get in there now. It's extremely dangerous. At least one of the units I know is there. Apparently, it came under really intense shelling this morning, or by this afternoon, well, by now. So we're talking, let's see, it's 3:10 in Donbas. So whatever, was it 1:10 with you chaps? The mood's completely changed. So I've just had word from a Ukrainian officer who was literally yesterday kind of transmitting, telling me all the stuff I've just told you, who's basically told us the Russians have been pushed back from the gains they made. He's just been in and out of Bakhmut today, and he said, quote unquote, it was all right. So the Russian claim of operational encirclement, that was the claim we had from an official from the so-called Donetsk People's Republic earlier today. I don't think that's true. I don't think there is what you could call an operational encirclement. Although I will always I will defer to Dom if there is I'm not getting the definition right. Maybe there is, but I'll tell you what is going on. What is going on is that you've got these, to help readers, let's draw a map, okay? Draw a perpendicular line, a horizontal line on a bit of paper. Then you draw two lines, parallel lines, perpendicular straight down. All right. Now the one on the left is, so the top line is the Siversky Donets River. The left line is the Kamenny Tarets River. That's where Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and Konstantinovka are. And then the right-hand vertical line is the Bakhmutska River. And that is, as the name suggests, where Bakhmut is. Now, between those two lines, you've got a huge series of hills, quite big ridges, high ground that the Ukrainians are hanging on to. Now, if you go down and below the perpendicular river line, draw another line linking those two perpendicular lines left to right, and then draw another line above that, and those are your two roads. The first one, the lower one, is the road between Konstantinovka and Bakhmut. Now that is a good road, a good metalled paved highway that takes you straight in there. That was what we were using all the time. That was if you were going from here to Bakhmut, that's what you would use. The Russians, we think, are within about 2 kilometers of that road on the southern side, and they're trying to push it, and then they're trying to get across that, and then go and cut that second road further north, which is the one that goes through Chasiv Yar that I was talking about yesterday. Now, I spoke to some soldiers who've just come out of Bakhmut this morning down in Konstantinovka. They'd done a 2-month tour in there and said all the things you expect about how grim it was. Their take on that road, that main road from Konstantinovka, is you can still do it if you put the pedal to the floor and you drive like crazy. It's under fire. They're hitting it all the time. You can speed through. The safest way is through the Chasiv Yar route. However, so we know some Ukrainian journalists who drove that route yesterday, and they witnessed 2 civilian cars with human bodies in that had been hit on that road at some point yesterday. I had a report. I can't confirm it. I was told that another team had their car destroyed while they were inside a building reporting inside the city. So both routes are under fire. but I don't think either of them have been cut yet. I think the way to take that statement from the Donetsk People's Republic, the Russian statement basically about operational encirclement, I certainly think that is a statement of intent and aspiration. I certainly think that's what they're trying to do. And anyone around who you talk to, from officers down to like rank and file squaddies, everyone thinks that's what they're trying to do. But I don't think they've done it yet. Coming back to what Dom was saying from the Western official about, oh, Solidar was a Pyrrhic victory and so on. I mean, I personally feel like they're kind of spin that a little bit, because, okay, yes, that chimes with what the squaddies are saying. So I was speaking to a couple of paratroopers who fought in Solid earlier this afternoon. I grabbed a coffee with them, and they were describing that. They were saying, look, like, they were sending just like these waves of people at us, just waves and waves of them, without armor support, without artillery support, and you just be gunning them down, but they just keep coming, and there's just not enough ammunition. So they were talking about kind of, you'd be holding a strong point and hoping that, someone on you're meant to cover the right and the left because it's a vantage point, but there should be someone else covering your right as well, and someone on your left, and there wouldn't be, and artillery support would be slow to come. There wouldn't be enough kind of armor. You'd run out of ammo, and you'd have to like be exposed going back 4 or 5 kilometers to get more ammo. So it's a pretty, although the Russians definitely are taking a lot of casualties, and they're not kind of worrying about how many of their guys die doing this, the sheer weight of numbers being brought to bear in this sector, I think, is telling. And I think the general atmosphere, the general sense here is that eventually, if it carries on with this sheer scale of force the Russians have brought to bear, that is gonna tell. And my educated guess would be in line with what that Western official told Dom, which is that there will be eventually perhaps a fallback to another prepared line. It's kind of defense in depth. I think that's probably what's going on here. But as I say, kind of today, the sense is that the situation in Bakhmut is slightly stabilized from yesterday.
Thanks, Roland. Can we talk a little bit about your dispatch, which was in today's paper, as well as talking to soldiers? You've also been talking to civilians, many of whom are understandably trying to leave. Can you tell us about the people you interviewed?
Yeah, so we're back up in Chasiv Yar the other day, which is, I was explaining in the podcast the other day, is the little town that sits on that second road, that safer road that's a bit further from the Russians' attempted encirclement. It's one of these places that is not quite the front line, but it's going to be the front line if Bakhmut falls, and it is taking fire from time to time. Life's incredibly difficult, and the mayor there is kind of preoccupied with persuading people to leave. Look, civilians, you really got to get out. And for those who aren't there, he's kind of frantically kind of procuring, I don't know, building materials, kind of stuff to a lot of houses. A lot of flats have lost their windows, so he's kind of desperately kind of procuring stuff to patch that up because it's winter, heating, all this kind of thing. And the thing is with these towns, as they empty, as the war gets closer, and this is a pattern, we've seen it again and again and again and again. Those who can leave, right? If you're able-bodied and you got a car and money or just somewhere to go, you go. And so you end up with a massively disproportionate number of the people who are left are basically very elderly or disabled, people who are immobile. And it's them and their carers. That's not everybody, but it's a large proportion. So we were in town yesterday, and there's a group of Finnish volunteers. There's some Ukrainian volunteers and also some Finnish volunteers, kind of organizations running these voluntary evacuations for people. And part of what they're trying to do is kind of persuade people it's time to go. But a lot of people aren't ready. It's such a big decision to make, right? That, okay, I've got to give up everything, got to give my flat, I don't know where I'm going and when I'm going to come back, and you've got to make this decision about what you're going to leave behind and things like that. And there's one woman there who had come from Kiev. She's in her 70s. She was 71, and she was born in Chasiv Yar, moved away, I think, in her 20s. She'd lived elsewhere. She now lives in Kiev. That's where her family are. Both her sons are in the army. And she came back a month ago to look after her elderly mother. Her mother is 92, living alone in a very ordinary residential flat. But, she's 92, she's almost immobile, she's had a couple of falls, all of that. And she didn't want to leave. Her daughter was saying to me, she's disoriented, she doesn't really grasp what's going on. All she knows is that something frightening is happening. She thinks people are going to come and kill her. And she was saying so she comes down to this evacuation point and grabs these guys, says, look, I've persuaded her, it's time to get out. We got to go, but you're going to have to come and get her, because can you come and get her? Because, she basically can't move. So we went round there with a couple of these Finnish guys who helped her down the stairs, kind of agonizingly slowly. And it was, it was a tough thing. I mean, this is an extremely old woman who really shouldn't be moved anywhere, but there is literally no choice. I mean, it was incredibly loud there yesterday. You could hear this kind of frantic battle going on just a few miles away with this Russian push that was going on at the same time. And anyway, got her down the stairs into the van, and she and her daughter set off. They have a place to go. They had train tickets. They, get to Kramatorsk, get on the train back to Kiev. There's family waiting for them. A lot of people don't have that. There were other people coming down and saying, "Oh, there's a guy whose wife's knees are gone. She's been waiting for an operation for ages. She can't get out of the house." And it was kind of inquiring about, could you come and get her? Well, yeah. Do you want us to? Well, not yet. So people you find yourself coming to terms, toying with the idea, drifting towards this inevitable decision of what you're going to have to do, but not being quite there yet. And of course, it's a race against time, right? Because eventually it's going to be too late to make this decision. Because if the Russian tide keeps rising, if they keep making advances, eventually that is going to be a frontline town, and it is going to be as badly destroyed as Bakhmut.
Thanks, Roland. Just one quick question from me. You mentioned the Finnish volunteers you encountered who are sort of there helping people evacuate. What's your experience of the foreign volunteers that you've come across in all of your reporting? I'm kind of curious about that. We've talked to quite a few volunteers who are doing different things in Ukraine, but what have you come across? What do you make of them?
I mean, there's a huge number of people. I think most of them are really genuinely dedicated people who want to help. In this case, I mean, there wasn't many other people offering help. I mean, there was a Ukrainian bunch of volunteers also, volunteers running an evacuation that day as well. But apart from then, I mean, that's your option to get out. So I think, in that particular instance, incredibly important. You meet all sorts going around, all sorts of people running organizations that of, kind of varying kind of connection with the authorities or the military or so on and so forth. I mean, I'd be hesitant to kind of say this is what a foreign volunteer is, because partly because they do such varied things. There's the Scottish guys who make pizzas, great, and deliver them. Then you have guys like this who are who've decided what we're going to do is we're going to go and get civilians out of really dangerous places, and that's a really necessary and very brave and actually very dangerous thing to do. I mean, those two Brits were killed doing that in the Solidar just a few weeks ago. And then you have, people who are actually fighting, so on and so forth. I mean, war is something that does attract certain characters, and there are the heroes, there are the people who want to do their bit. I mean, there's always a few whack jobs around as well. Not including anyone who I met yesterday in that category, but you will meet people knocking around a war zone who, you'll be thinking God, what's that person doing here? What are they really up to? So a very, very varied kind of field. But I think what those guys were doing was basically, an extremely important and ultimately life-saving thing.
Well, thank you very much, Roland. Francis Sternley, you've got quite a few diplomatic updates. Talk us through them.
Well, thanks, David, and do stay safe, Roland. Extraordinary hearing your reports. I want to start with military donations to Ukraine. The biggest one that we're hearing about today is that Washington is preparing to send a $2 billion package of military aid to Ukraine, including missiles with the range to cover almost the entire country. That's according to US officials who say that the announcement will likely come this week. That's according to Reuters. Now, this will be the first time that ground-launched small-diameter bombs, that's GLSDB, a new weapon that was designed by Boeing, which I think we've touched on in the past on the podcast, would be sent. Now, these are cheap gliding missiles that have a range of more than 90 miles, that's about 150 kilometres, due to fold-out wings, which extend their range. That's a dramatic increase of over 80 kilometres range of the HIMARS rocket systems, which, of course, have changed the face of this war when Washington sent them last summer. it would mean now that every inch of Russian-occupied Ukraine, apart from most of the Crimean peninsula, interestingly, would be in range of Ukrainian forces, which would likely force Moscow to redistribute ammunition and fuel shortage sites. In terms of other donations, Spain are planning to send between 4 and 6, should I say, German-built Leopard tanks to Ukraine. That's obviously following their permission being granted by Germany. The actual number will depend on the condition of the battle tanks in storage and how many other countries will eventually supply to Ukraine. But I mention it just to talk to this tally that continues to increase as the days go by. On the question of planes, some very striking remarks by the Czech president-elect, Peter Pavel, who we've already spoken about at length this week. He's told the BBC in an interview that, in his view, the F-16's planes, of course the fighter jets that we've spoken about at length, were not a taboo in terms of sending them, but he was unsure whether they could be delivered in a time frame that would prove useful to Kyiv. He also made some other interesting remarks, which I just wanted to go over, which is that he said that in his view, Ukraine should be allowed to join NATO as soon as the war is over. He is, of course, a retired NATO general, and in his view, Ukraine would be morally and practically ready to join the Western alliance once the conflict has ended. He also went on, I thought this was particularly interesting, going beyond the question of Ukraine. He says that in his view, EU states need to drop any illusions about China, saying that his country, of course, Czech Republic, would no longer behave like an ostrich over divergent interests with Beijing. And I'll read his quote in full. "This is what we have to be very clear about. China and its regime is not a friendly country at this moment. It is not compatible with Western democracies in their strategic goals and principles. This is simply a fact that we have to recognise." Now, I should say that the first interview where he talked about Ukraine was in the BBC. That second one where he talked about China was with the Financial Times, and I'd highly recommend both, particularly the Financial Times one, just because of that extraordinary insight into his thinking on the geopolitical positioning with regard to China, which of course is an extensive issue we've covered on this podcast due to the relation to Ukraine, but also because of the broader issues of the geopolitical blocks that have started to formulate as a consequence of the war. Just a couple of other pieces in the diplomatic space before I conclude. There's a big meeting, an EU summit meeting due in Kyiv this week, and this is particularly on the question of whether Ukraine will be permitted in the future to join the European Union. Yesterday, Volodymyr Zelensky was saying that he hoped the summit, which we're expecting to happen on Friday, would reflect a high level of cooperation and progress with the rest of the bloc, which of course Kyiv has sought to join. As part of this, we're expecting a formal announcement of what the current tank tally is. We're up to around 140, I think, by our calculations. But as I say, they are increasing all of the time. So that's quite interesting. And of course, we'll be following that more closely in the coming days. And just lastly, Japan is also preparing to host a group of the G7, a summit meeting timed with the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. That's according to a news agency over there. I conclude with that because, again, speaks to the theme that I touched on yesterday, which is the increasing role in which the Pacific is stepping up in its support not only of Ukraine, but recognising the geopolitical challenges that are taking place as a consequence of that, as regard to China and Taiwan, but also as they're forming closer bonds with the rest of the Western powers. There have been numerous treaties that have been signed, most recently one between Japan and Britain. And it's very, very interesting just, again, seeing the ripple effect as countries begin to wake up to the increasing challenges posed by more autocratic regimes, which, of course, the war in Ukraine has drawn particular attention to. So lots going on in terms of a way that I think Ukraine would see as positive. A slightly more sceptical one on which to conclude, though, which is some interesting remarks from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, who said that he's considering military aid to Ukraine. That would be, that's quite noticeable that he said he's considering it. But I think it's fair to say, and Dom and I were talking about this earlier on, that his remarks are incredibly lukewarm, to say the least, at the notion. So He talks about that how Israel would be willing to serve as a mediator in the war given the right circumstances, but then goes on and talks about how he doesn't want to make any firm commitments to Ukraine. He says he's looking into matters. I've asked all of the relevant parties. I'll certainly consider playing a more senior diplomatic role, but I'm not pushing myself in. So, as I say, these are lukewarm, but there may be some signs of there being a little bit more of a shift in a more pro-Ukrainian direction. But all of this needs to be contextualized in the fact that Israel does not want to upset Russia traditionally in recent years because of the role that it plays in enabling Israel to strike in Syria, in neighbouring Syria, and turning a blind eye there to those strikes on all sorts of issues, and of course because of Russia's brokerage role with regard to a future Iran nuclear deal. So Israel finds itself in quite a delicate diplomatic situation, but there will be many people who will be calling for Israel to do more, and are doing so, I should say. So no doubt we'll return to that again too. So a busy landscape today, David, but one that, as I say, we'll be turning to some of these things, I think, later in the week.
Thank you very much, Francis, for that. It's a great pleasure now to welcome our guest, Olga Lautman. Olga, thank you so much for your time today. Would you start just by introducing yourself to our listeners? Tell us a bit about yourself and your work and research.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So I am a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and I focus basically on the intersection of organized crime, intelligence services, and the Kremlin. I am a senior researcher at the Institute for European Integrity, which is the project where we are looking at NGOs that have been captured by foreign states in order to run operations in Europe. And I am a coordinator for the Syria-Ukraine network, and I basically work to connect Syrian groups with Ukrainian groups based on their expertise so we can, help document war crimes and all the atrocities happening in Russia. But I've been following Russia, their, domestic politics and policies and military strategies my whole life. And basically, I've been trying to put out as much information as I can for the people in the West who might not be as aware.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction. We wanted to talk to you to focus a little bit on the role of the Orthodox Church in Russia. There's an article you've written for SIPA, an unorthodox Russian vision of heaven and hell, which went into quite a bit of detail about what you see as the roles, and to some extent the responsibility and the involvement of the religious establishment in the state. And there was a lot in that which I think would be of huge interest to our listeners. So could you just start for us, and just to set the scene, what is the religious landscape across the Russian Federation, and where have you been focusing your attention?
So the religious landscape is very diverse. Obviously, the Russian Orthodox Church has the most followers, I believe around 40%. It's not a super religious, society, but religion over the past few decades has definitely gained prominence in it. But religion has a very long history in Russia. During the Tsars, the Orthodox Church was used basically it was a tool of the state, and it was used, to push that the Tsars were enthroned by God and that you must be loyal to them, not question them. And it was also used by intelligence services to collect information on the parishioners. And then we get to the Bolsheviks, who basically, desecrated the churches, arrested the clergymen, tortured, assassinated some. And, and the church for a while, was not active. Then under Stalin, the church was rehabilitated. Even though Stalin himself was an atheist, he saw that the church can be used as a tool to garner support for World War II. And he brought it in, but when he brought it in under the direct control of the NKGB, which is the predecessor to KGB, and then it went into KGB's hands. So the church was very carefully managed by the KGB intelligence services, and then we learned about this actually after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the Duma had a commission, and they basically, unlocked the files of the Orthodox Church, revealing that, for instance, Patriarch Kirill was a KGB agent used to infiltrate various organizations. Patriarch Alexei was a KGB agent, and they saw the depth of the KGB services inside the church.
Can we talk a little bit about Patriarch Kirill here? He's a key character in contemporary Russian on the contemporary Russian religious scene. Can you tell us a bit more about him? What's his history and what's his relationship with Putin and others in the establishment?
So, like I said, Patriarch Kirill was a KGB agent during the Soviet Union under the Orthodox Church. And then when Putin came into power, he again, revived the Orthodox Church to be used as a tool. And Patriarch Kirill became extremely wealthy, and he has a very close relationship to Putin, became wealthy, and the church basically was turned into another like a tool of the intelligence services, both domestically and abroad.
Well, we'll get onto that later, I think. Can I just take you to something you've written in the article? You wrote that the church, quote, has been at the forefront of Russia's unprovoked all-out assault against Ukraine. Can you take us into that a little bit? How and why?
So the church has been used to push this, full-scale invasion in Ukraine. Kirill came out and basically said that, quote, anyone who sacrifices in the course of carrying out their military duty washes away all sins. But not only has the church fully supported Russia's genocide and aggression inside Ukraine, but they've also, a few months ago, actually started a mercenary group to recruit people to send to Ukraine, basically under the flag of the church. The church later on, when it kind of became a scandal inside of Russia, when that happened, they denied it. But one of the people who was heading the St. Andrew's Cross is the name of the mercenary group. His name is Vladimir Kilchenko. He said, in fact, the first PMC, or private military company, which, by the way, is illegal inside of Russia, under the Russian Orthodox Church. So, he acknowledged in a local interview that St. Andrew's Cross indeed was the first private mercenary group, or again, like I said, they're illegal, but that it was working under the Orthodox Church to recruit volunteers to send to Ukraine for war.
You mentioned that Patriarch Kirill is outspoken in his support of the full-scale invasion and of President Putin. Do you get much of a sense of any dissension from the other clergy, or is it just too difficult to say across the entire federation?
I mean, for the most part, everybody is in full support. There was one clergy who spoke out against it and basically, had to leave Russia. But for the most part, everyone is in line to the Orthodox Church for, Russia's atrocities and in full support and making sure to try to garnish as much support as they can from their parishioners.
You mentioned that, their interests are intertwined. So I'm just wondering, do you think, from your perspective, a personal perspective, that when Patriarch Kirill says, if you go and fight, your sins will be washed away, do you think he really believes that? Or is that just the right thing to say in support of the regime?
I think he actually does believe that because he's part of the old guard from the Soviet Union, and this is the thought, and the hardliners are in full support of Russia's atrocities campaign, because they do want to reinstate Ukraine and the Baltics and, other former Soviet countries back into the Soviet Union, because a lot of them have still not gotten over the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fact that, these countries have basically moved forward and sought democracies and established democratic government and so forth.
We've talked about Patriarch Kirill. Is there anyone else we should know about that's important and relevant in this discussion?
Well, I believe Konstantin Malofeyev is probably one of the most important, and he became known. He's actually indicted and sanctioned in Europe, indicted and sanctioned in the United States. he was at the forefront of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. He is one of the biggest pro-Kremlin Orthodox billionaires, runs, several media outlets appealing to the traditional values, but more so of what he does domestically is what he does across Europe and the United States. In Europe, he has cultivated the far right in order to, under the guise of traditional values, to bring in various religious groups. And then they push a culture war in as part of their division operations. And we've been seeing this, play out over the past several years in Europe. And you see Russia's support for far-right candidates in Europe. They're financing. He actually financed Marie Le Pen. You have a huge operation running in Italy, in Germany, and the same thing with the United States with the evangelical movement and various other organizations. And here it's, again, for the same purpose of causing cultural war and causing division, because if you weaken a country, it's easier to implode it.
I'm curious as to how all of this plays out sort of from the pulpit, if you like. At the beginning of January was Orthodox Christmas. Can you tell us a little bit about how the church celebrated that? I mean, for example, in the Anglican Church in the UK, we would hear Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury's Christmas message. Was there a Kirill equivalent? How did any of this sort of play out in the actual sacraments, in the services themselves? Do we have an idea about that?
Well, I mean, for a change, besides the atrocities we saw being committed, Orthodox, during Orthodox Christmas, when the Kremlin offered their, quote, unquote, ceasefire, the message coming from Patriarch Kirill was very somber. He did mention the war, but he, referred to it as, quote, special military operation. And it was basically, he asked people to pray for the wounded and dead. So it was nothing, spectacular about his messaging at that point.
You talked just then actually about the sort of the cultural element of this, of funding, of encouraging division in foreign states. Do you think that the West is waking up to this threat as you see it, or is this something that's really not appreciated?
I think they haven't grasped fully the threat that comes out of the Orthodox Church, because it really is an appendage of the Russian intelligence services, and it is really one of the last operations that are still running. And just to give you an example, the article I wrote for SIPA, I had posted it, everything was fine, it was on Google, and then I shared it with a few people, and then suddenly it got buried on Google. It got shadow banned on Twitter, and it was extremely hard to find the article. And I spoke with SIPA about it. They looked into it, and indeed there was something going on there. So I reposted it. Finally, my article is back on Google, where it belongs. But the point is, it was a threat to Russia and their intelligence services, because it is the last active intelligence branch that is operating in the United States, across Europe, and obviously we see in Ukraine, to the point that even Latvia a few months ago ordered the separation of the Latvian Orthodox Church from the Orthodox Church in Moscow, and they called it a national security threat. So the Eastern European countries obviously are recognizing the threat, because they're always ahead of the game, because they are Russia's neighbors and have been, under direct assault and with various operations over the past few decades. But I don't think that the rest of Europe and the United States, fully understands what is happening with the Orthodox Church, and that it is being used as a tool, to push, like I said, these culture wars, run division operations, and also cultivate, leaders from main religious parties across the globe. And now they've also focused heavily in Africa. We see their influence in Syria. So I think it's something that, the West really needs to wake up to as a threat.
I've got other questions as well, but just at this point, I think it would be good potentially to bring in Roland, Dom, or Francis. We really haven't touched a lot on religion and the Orthodox Church in Russia, despite going for many episodes. So this is we will absolutely do more on this. But thank you, Olga, for your answers. Roland, Dom, and Francis, do you have any questions?
I do. Thank you very much, Olga, for your time today. I've got a couple of questions, if I may. The first one is perhaps the most simple, which is what more can Western governments be doing to sanction some of these individuals? It seems that there is a real blind spot here in terms of we've been sanctioning oligarchs, but so little seems to be done to some of these very senior figures in the church. Is there more that should be being done, and how can that be done?
Absolutely. I mean, they just start, seeing the Orthodox Church as a tool to subvert democracy and to run operations. And for starters, I mean, it needs to be taken out of the council, and the main figures in the church need to be sanctioned. In U.S., I personally would love to see the church have to fill out a FARA in order to show that their loyalty and direction is under the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. In Ukraine, in 2018, I believe they actually started, this, and they basically forced every church to recognize where they are getting their. And if it was for Moscow, and it had to be known, so the parishioners know that this is coming, the messaging is coming from Moscow. And even in Ukraine, there have been several arrests over the past few months with the Russian Orthodox Church, including one abbot who was convicted as a spy, and he was basically passing information on activists, on military positions to the Russian army. So you have these churches, the people who are part of them, who are being used for espionage operations during an act of war.
Thank you. And my next question is relating to the authenticity of the faith of some of these patriarchs like Kirill. I mean, to be a true believer in communist doctrine, one was supposed to be an atheist and to denounce the church. And indeed, in the 1920s, 1930s, prior to Stalin, late era Stalin, the church was really heavily persecuted. Churches were destroyed, their power stripped, etc. So how do we reconcile that kind of attitude of communism with these former KGB agents who are now so high up in the church? Is it just pure Machiavellianism on their part? They see the power and the opportunity of the church and they leap on it? Or is there real true faith there, do you think? I just wonder if you've got any more thoughts on that theme.
I think it's for power, and I think, they see that Putin was, it was beneficial to them to align with Putin because they can promote, the church. And at the same time, like I said, Patriarch Kirill, he is one of the wealthiest people inside of Russia. So clearly there's, financial rewards that come for being head of the church. And I apologize, I wanted to correct something. World Council of Churches, I don't know why I'm thinking of Congress, but World Council of Churches, they need to be removed from there. But getting back to your question, I think it has to do, with power. I don't believe they are true believers because, there isn't that much of an ideology inside of Russia. I mean, under the communists, you had the ideology of communism, but now, over the past 3 decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically, the ideology is to make sure that Putin stays in power and is able to rob the state, and him and his inner circle protected.
Olga, hi, it's Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us today. I just have one question, please. And I just wonder if you could talk to us about the links between the Ukrainian and the Russian Orthodox churches and whether or not they were moving away from each other before Maidan and what's happened since. Was that a moment where there was a complete schism and never the twain shall meet, or is there room behind the politics and the espionage and the kleptocracy for them to still have any kind of relationship at a religious level?
So in Ukraine, it started moving away towards Maidan, but still Maidan was kind of, you still had the pro-Russian support, and then you had Ukrainians, and you see based on polling that has changed. Now you have upwards of 80 plus people who want in Ukraine who want to move towards Europe, towards the West, and only, a small percentage who actually still believe that being close and aligned with Russia is the right path. But more so in 2018, under the former president Poroshenko, he signed a law requiring the Orthodox, the Moscow Patriarch, to change his name so it could be shown that of their operations under Moscow's Russian Orthodox Church. More so, you also have a breaking away between the churches, which was huge for Russia. I mean, this really infuriated them, where the Ukrainian Church, Orthodox Church, basically developed their own branch. So you've definitely seen this moving away, and you've seen more focus, more so since last February, because now the church, like I said, I mean, the one arrest I mentioned, there are several investigations in churches across the country who are being used to actually pass intelligence to the Russian army, to Russian intelligence services, and so forth.
Thank you, Dom and Francis, for your questions. Roland, I don't know if you can hear us. I know your connection isn't great, but do you have anything to add or any questions?
Hello. I suppose, there's lots of things running through my mind because, of course, the relationship between the church and the state and the secret services and all of this it's a huge theme, actually, that goes through things. I was wondering if you could comment on my kind of view or experience of kind of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, which is that, yes, there is the hierarchy linked to the Kremlin, and which is, very well documented kind of, since Stalin, you only make it to the top if you're working for the KGB, and all of that. But I've also encountered kind of, parish priests who are real linchpins of communities, people who perhaps don't have much connection or even that much sympathy for the higher ups in a sense. I mean, there's I don't know if you read a book by Oliver Buller called The Last Man in Russia, which is about a parish priest who was basically the guy who was combating alcoholism. Basically, he found a way to combat alcoholism and ended up getting crushed by the hierarchy. In your view, do you view the Russian Orthodox Church as kind of rotten from top to bottom, that the entire thing is basically an FSB, a Russian state structure and suspect, or do you recognize that within it there are nuances and differences? I mean, it's an enormous organization, and that at lower levels there are perhaps people who don't have anything to do with that, or do you think that everybody involved is compromised?
I definitely don't believe every single person involved is compromised, and in the case that, for instance, you mentioned, this is where the problem becomes, because there you have the security services so penetrated in the church that a priest who actually wants to push policies, if they don't fall in line with what the hierarchy wants, then they will be either pushed out or silenced or sabotaged in what they are trying to do. So it's definitely not top to bottom, but the main decisions basically have to have the approval of the Russian security services and the hierarchy.
Olga, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything we haven't spoken about that you want to mention or to clarify, or anything that we haven't asked you that you think maybe we should have talked about?
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for covering this topic. No, I think we pretty much covered everything. And again, I just want people to understand the importance, and more so, in Europe and United States, to look at this as a tool, And obviously, we're not supposed to persecute every single church, but they should be monitored for running intelligence operations, for, their support. Even in the United States, a few local, Russian Orthodox churches are absolutely cheering this, and this is the death of innocent men, women, children inside of Ukraine, who did nothing to provoke Russia except having their own statehood. So I think, I'm happy that you covered this topic, and thank you for this platform. And I just hope, that there are some actions taken to see that this is yet another tool of subversion.
Well, Olga, thank you so much for your time. And yes, you've definitely talked about several things that would be good to get into in the future. This is what's often so interesting speaking to our guests, is usually we leave with more things to cover than the thing we've talked about. So thank you so much for your time. It was really fascinating. And thank you, Roland, Dom and Francis, for your thoughts on that as well. I thought that was a really interesting discussion. We're starting to run out of time together, I'm afraid. So can I go to all of you just for your very final thoughts? So we'll go to potentially Roland first, because I know you have to get away, and we'll end with Olga. So Roland Oliphant, what are you looking at in the next few days? What would you want our listeners to go away and think about?
I'm going to be probably looking at this epic battle in Bakhmut. I mean, the Battle of Bakhmut is now, I think, the longest running battle of the war. It's gone on for 6 months, more than 6 months. It's still going on. It's this kind of, it's like the black hole at the center of a galaxy almost. I mean, it sucks in all this stuff from both sides. And I think it's horrible, but it also kind of is the emblem. It's the absolute kind of distillation of this sense of stalemate, but also of, like, I don't know, sometimes almost indifference. I kind of feel like you look at this and Dom was quoting a Western official earlier saying, well, this looks like it's going to go on for a long time if it carries on like this. Well, that's what everybody here says. I mean, I've been speaking to people who are like, yeah, we're looking like 3, 4, 5 years, and Russia's got X million, tens of millions more people than we have. I mean, the outlook here, it's just grim. It's just incredibly grim. And I kind of I mean, at the risk of breaking the rules and getting emotional, or getting angry, I mean, I do wonder whether all these Western leaders kind of patting themselves on the back for having finally, after a year, decided they're going to send some tanks, really have a grasp of what is actually going on here. I mean, if they actually, if the West is serious about, actually we want Ukraine to win the war, I mean, they've got to bloody do something about it, because the way, I mean, what we're looking at now at the moment is it cannot be allowed to carry on. It's just it's years and years of bloodshed and grimness that on paper, if you ask someone about, do you think that's good? Do you think we should stop that kind of thing? Do you think that's something you should allow to happen? Of course you'd say no. Of course not. You could, but here we are, and I hate the idea of what's happening here becoming like a fact of life, like one of those things that people go off and go, kind of shake their heads and go, oh, I know you have ideals when you're young, but you have to accept the way the world is. There's a war in Ukraine. It's been going on for 10 years. You just got to live with it. That's my indignant thought for the day. And I'll leave it there before I rant any longer.
Thank you very much, Roland. Thank you so much for making time for us in your reporting, and do stay safe. It sounds really horrible out there, and we're all thinking of you. So thank you again for joining us. Dom or Francis, do you want to go next?
Okay, I'll jump in next, and I'd like to just respond to a listener question, please. So, Graham, thanks for asking the question, and apologies if I've been using military wonkisms, but Graham asked what the phrase operationally significant means. I say that the battle for Bakhmut, and certainly Solidar, if it's taken by Russia, Solidar is, and if Bakhmut is taken by Russia, that won't necessarily be operationally significant. Now, what do I mean by that? So the military talks in terms of sort of levels of activity. Right at the top, there's strategic, and then in the middle there's operations, and at the bottom there's tactics. So individual unit actions are tactics, and tanks move over this side of the wood, and infantry run that side of the wood. Those are tactics. And if you think they're all building blocks, so a lot of tactics build to make an operational breakthrough, and then operational campaigns knit together to make a strategy. And so when I'm talking operationally significant, I mean, for example, Russia's ejection from the north of the country in the first few weeks of the war. That was operationally significant because that changed the face of the war. It changed the shape of the war, and certainly the time of the war, if not the eventual outcome, because we don't know what that is yet. But it was a major change in what was happening. Another operationally significant thing that might happen, haven't happened yet, but if, we've spoken about it many times on the pod, if Ukraine were able to push through the Russian lines and get down to the coast, sort of through Melitopol and just to the west of Mariupol, if they were able to get to the coast there and then hold that, they would split Russia's forces into the Crimean Peninsula and just to the north, and the Donbas. So Russian forces would be split in two. So that move would be operationally significant. It would be a major change in the war. It wouldn't necessarily bring about the end of the war immediately, but it's a fundamental alteration in the way that the war would be carried out. So Bakhmut is an important city. It's a logistic node. It's, as Roland's been talking about, the road and the communication lines through there. It leads to other places. So, of course, Russia wants to take that and keep, as they want to do, keep heading west. And Ukraine don't want to give up an inch of their territory. But the loss of that city in and of itself does not mean that, that's going to fundamentally change the way the war is then prosecuted or lead to another major operation that immediately follows on from it. So operationally significant are those major building blocks, not as big as the entire war, but equally much bigger than individual unit actions of tactics, of clearing trenches or of clearing a hill line or moving tanks around here and working with the artillery and all the rest of it. So those are very low level. I'd shudder to use ground level tactics because everything's at ground level ultimately. But tactics are the small little Lego blocks that build up to make operational campaigns, and then they build towards a big strategy. So the operational level, if you like, is the middle bit, the big sizable chunks of movement. Ukraine pushing through in Kharkiv in the east last September, that massive reversal from Russia being ejected from Kharkiv and the east, that was operationally significant because it really shifted the momentum for that time, but didn't ultimately bring about the end of the war. That's not what operational stuff does, but knit enough of them together, and it will do. So, Graham, thanks for your question, and I hope I've answered that, and I apologise for using military wonkisms.
It's quite all right, Dom. Thank you for your answer. Francis Sternley.
Thanks, David. We've referenced Stalin today several times, and I wanted to end with reports that ahead of the 80th anniversary of the Red Army's victory in the Battle of Stalingrad during the Second World War, new monuments to Stalin, as well as Soviet generals Vasilevsky and Zhukov, have been unveiled in the city, which, of course, today is known as Volgograd. For decades, the concerted aim has been in Russia to play down the excesses of the communist regime, the show trials, the purges, the gulags, the abuses of human rights, and the denial of individual freedom. We saw the erasure of Memorial last year, remembering Stalin's crimes, and this plays into that. Journalists and academics have reporting for a long time, and I think alarm bells should have been sounded earlier, really, in European capitals as to the culture of fear and historical distortion that Putin has been stoking for many, many years now. And on that theme of how warning signs are so often ignored, I was struck by a column in our paper by former editor Charles Moore, who drew attention to a piece in our paper from 100 years ago last week. And I'll read what that report said. So the headline was, "Disquieting Reports of Bavarian Situation." As I say, this is from Saturday, January 27th, 1923. The story goes on. Germany is threatened by a complication of the gravest kind. Following the success of the fascist march on Rome the previous October, Mussolini's counterpart, Adolf Hitler, has decided to declare war to the knife against the Bavarian government. This news is a very gloomy omen. This Austrian house painter, who during the war served as a simple soldier in the German army, has in Bavaria a large body of fanatically devoted adherents prepared blindly to do his bidding. The danger is wider than Bavaria. It is impossible to say what latent forces might come to the surface in his support in other parts of Germany, were he once to attempt the revolution so often threatened by his disciples. So World War II, one could argue, was predictable if people had paid attention to what academics and others were citing at the time, as I would argue were Putin's imperialist ambitions. Sadly, those warnings were ignored, and Ukraine and the wider world are now paying the price for that naivety.
Well, thank you, Roland, Dom and Francis. Olga Lautman, as our guest, would you like the very final words?
I wanted to thank Roland for, covering the atrocities on the ground and for recognizing the human toll, it's taking, because sometimes it escapes coverage. in regular media and you just hear, this attack happened, but there are actual people suffering, families dying, children being left without parents. So I really wanted to thank him for that. And thank you for having me.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Giles Gear and Isabel Bouchard, and today on Twitter, Robbie Nichols.